A brief history of time. Time has always been an intrinsic dimension of music, as music literally is when we hear certain sounds or notes and how they're related in the course of time. Let's explore that dimension. Tempo. Over the course of history, composers have tried to give different tempi different names, which can basically be categorised in three ways: slow, medium, and fast. Italy was the epicentre of music innovation in the 17th century. Therefore, Italian names were established in these categories, like grave, which means heavy, or largo, which means broad, or even just allegro, which means fast, and many more expressions like these. Tempo, the speed at which music is played, has a direct effect on how we feel about something that we hear. Different tempi make you feel different ways. You can't dance to dance music when the music is too slow, and you're not going to end up in a sad mood when the funeral music is way too fast. This is why different genres of music are connected to different tempi, which we'll touch on a little bit later. We can explore this idea quite literally. Let's take a look at a piece about the moon. Debussy wrote Clair de Lune, which literally just means moonlight, in 1905. It's supposed to be played andante tre expressif, meaning moderately slow and expressive. So this could be a tempo that Debussy originally intended his Moonlight piece to be played at. Okay, you may have heard that piece somewhere else before. It's nice and relaxing, it's a bit wistful, but what happens if we play it much faster? When we hear this, it sounds kind of funny, right? But that's because we know that it's meant to be played slow, and now it's been played way too fast. However, just on its own, without the context, it doesn't sound funny by itself. It's our knowledge about the piece that tricks our feelings a bit. But how does it feel when we listen to just the melody being played fast? Instead of feeling wistful, I'm feeling that this is a bit more jolly, a bit more carefree, and it definitely feels more positive. I can sort of imagine it more in a trumpet than I can on a piano. No, I'm not going to do that, don't worry. We can keep exploring this idea a bit more, and we can actually stay directly with some more moon-related music. We're going to look at another famous piano piece, Ludwig van Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, which funnily wasn't named Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven himself, but by some marketing expert, trying to sell this piece after Beethoven had died. Its original title is Sonata quasi una fantasia, a sonata which is like a fantasy. It's a sonata written in 3 movements, in the traditional sonata form, which was a common compositional form during the classical period. This classical form, before the Romantic period where people were having fun messing around with it a bit more, dictated 3 movements of music written in a fairly systematic way. The first section is the exposition, the setting out of the thematic material. The second is the development, where the themes could be varied and modulate. And the third section is called the recapitulation, where we come back to our themes from the exposition, sort of like an altered repeat. Now, another key detail about sonata form was that nearly always the tempo of the first movement was meant to be a fairly fast tempo, allegro, which translates as fast, quick, and bright. The second movement would then provide some contrast in a slower tempo, and the third would then be fast and dance-like. You might also have a fourth movement, a coda or a passagallia, that could also be a bit more creative, but the key thing here is that the form was nearly always fast, slow, fast. We'll just concentrate on the first movement. Beethoven himself described the way it should be played as adagio sostenuto, which literally means carried out slowly. However, nowadays, even amongst music historians, there's a lot of doubt that Beethoven would have wanted it to be played so slowly. The first reason is that by playing it so super slow as we know it, Beethoven would have escaped the traditional sonata form, as the second movement is also pretty slow. And the third movement is amazingly fast. Beethoven is known to have been a revolutionary composer who liked to break with the rules, but I doubt that he would have gone so far as to destroy such a well-established form. Moreover, there are music historians who would argue that the first movement is a reference to a part of Mozart's opera Don Giovanni. If Beethoven, who is admittedly a big fan of Mozart, wanted this pattern to be recognised in this sonata, then the first movement would have to have been played way faster than we know it, almost double the speed. Now, this much faster movement of the Moonlight Sonata carries a totally different feeling. Instead of a grave, slowly carried out funeral procession, it becomes more like a march. Back in the day, composers didn't have the ability to fix the tempo they wanted their music to be played at. So basically, it all came down to the interpretation of the player and how fast or slow they felt andante or any other tempo marking actually was. Therefore, different players played the same piece at different tempi, which could lead to a very different emotional experience for the audience. If we go back in time a little further, we think that the first metronome was probably invented in the 9th century. But the ticking side-to-side mechanical metronome that we usually picture was patented in 1815, which was also the first year that any composer indicated a metronome mark in their music. Coincidentally, also Beethoven, around 14 years after he completed his Moonlight Sonata. We mentioned earlier that tempo indications before this point in time were just descriptive words, like rather slow and broad, or at walking pace, or just very fast. Maybe there are other reasons we can't know exactly what these fluid definitions really meant. A few hundred years ago, the average height was lower, right? So shorter people means shorter stride length. So is their walking speed slower? Or did they just all walk really fast? Is all classical music intended to be slower than we play it currently? Maybe we'll never know that, but we do know that since the metronome was patented, we basically use beats per minute to indicate our musical tempo now. Over the next 200 years or so, things get quite interesting, and we end up with lots of technology that really uses BPM as a basis for music making. We get sequencers, we need to start being able to expertly sync to picture, and we even start to see that certain genres are perhaps even defined by tempo. Take some electronic genres, like trance or drum and bass. Is drum and bass still drum and bass if it's 20 BPM slower? I don't know, I'm basically saying that it isn't, that it would sound like something else. But within this, there's also an implication that a lot of music in the last 30 years or so has been not just at defined tempos, but fixed tempos, and that our idea of tempo has changed and is a bit more rigid, more on the grid. Back to our example of Debussy's Clair de Lune. You could say that at a fixed tempo, it doesn't sound that great, that it loses some of its feeling or its expression by becoming rigid. Look, I'm not saying that EDM lacks expression, by the way. I'm just saying that in most cases in classical music, whether it's a piano or an orchestra, we find that the musical performance lives and breathes through tempo. The Debussy example doesn't sound unrealistic because of a bad piano sound or a lack of dynamics. It sounds bad because it has no tempo variation, which is an intentional part of the music and of that genre of music and how it's designed to have an effect on the audience. It's written within the notation here. We have Italian terms like accelerando and ritardando, rubato and so on, to indicate speeding up, slowing down, or being away from the beat in some way. If a real person played like this, we'd judge their performance badly. But all too often we actually do this, because if we measure them against a grid, we can see and hear whether they're hitting the beat or not. Having a metronome doesn't fix everything either. It can lead to other problems, like us not only measuring the tempo precisely, but also the musician's performance. Let's try something. I have a musical idea and I know the way I want it to sound. So I just need to figure out how to get it into the computer, into the DAW. So for now, I'm just going to record the guitar, but without the click, just to capture the musical idea. Right, the notes are here in my timeline, but you can see that they're definitely not on any beats. So I want to figure out the tempo more or less of my little pattern, and I'm just going to do that with a metronome app on my phone. Right, so I think it's about 86 BPM or thereabouts. So I'm going to redo this recording at a fixed tempo this time, 86 BPM. Apparently, my notes and my chords are all on the beats now, but they're not precisely on the beats. You can see here, this one's slightly behind, this one's slightly ahead, and zooming in, it becomes obvious that I didn't really hit any beat with absolute precision. Which is fine, I guess. I'm not a machine. We're saying that not hitting the beat precisely is totally fine. Well, of course that's fine. Musicians pretty much never going to be dead on the grid. Music can be played freely and as a musician interprets and intends to play it. So in this case, I probably don't want to go in and edit my recording to make it dead on the grid either. We still want to retain a bit of that musical expression that comes across by not being perfect. So, why even record to the grid? There's a very intrinsic reason. Music needs structure. We could argue that my initial recording didn't have any real structure before, that it was kind of all over the place. But recording it to a click has given it some structure, and it's definitely better for it. And I'm communicating my music better to the listener as a result of nailing the tempo down. The grid also makes sense when you want to collaborate with other musicians on a project. If I want to send this guitar part to somebody else to work on, now they don't have to guess at what I'm doing. And of course, a piece of music doesn't necessarily have to have one fixed tempo. It can consist of different parts that have different tempi, and the tempo can even vary within one section too. We can program these changes on the tempo track, and we have a separate video on just that. But for now, I don't want to think about clicks or grids or metronomes or sonatas anymore. I just want to grab my guitar and play under the moon.